ladies and gentlemen. Keenan Wynn with Windy Fishing Guide Service. I wanted to present this data before opener. It's kind of a summation of the fishery on Mille. Opener is 2.5 days away. After I submit my final assignment, I will be going home and preparing for the season. I'm very passionate about fishing, and my grandfather instilled in me a love for walleye fishing, and that has trickled into smallmouth bass, largemouth bass, muskie, and I really enjoy the biological aspect of it as well. I'm getting a biology degree at University of Minnesota Morris at the moment. I'll be done in another year, and that degree has really given me the ability to interpret data in different ways and summarize them. It's a lot of what I've done at Morris, and I wanted to do the same thing with our fishery at Mille. So just a quick summation of the smallmouth bass population in Mille. So overall status of the fishery, this is just a personal observation, but I do believe there's a small decline in fish population. This could be specific to highly pressured areas. The particular places that I'm thinking about when I say this are highly pressured. This is not me saying that we catch less fish. This is just saying that on certain areas that are targeted more heavily, it seems like fish are less prevalent. There's been an increase in fishing pressure over the years. Since our Bassmaster tournaments, we have had a drastic increase in fishing pressure, and that has resulted in full boat ramps and a lot of anglers traveling from the United States, all from across the United States to come and fish our fishery. So the management plan, the state is continuing to manage the lake as a trophy fishery. Tom Heinrich, who is the Mille area fishery supervisor, defined this trophy as 20 inches and greater. So that is how the state is managing this lake for fish that are 20 inches and greater, as well as a good population, but they're managing it for a trophy population. Status of the fishery continued. So COVID-19 limited 2020 smallmouth bass sampling. For this reason, the sample size was drastically reduced in the 2020 year. So the sample size in 2019 was 274 smallmouth bass, and this represents the length disbursement across the population, and then the sample size was 76 in 2020 due to only 1 day of electrofishing sampling. So electrofishing, if you're not familiar, it is where the DNR drive around with a boat equipped with electrodes that go into the water, and they shock the water with electricity, and it temporarily stuns all of the fish in the vicinity, not just smallmouth, but all of the fish in the vicinity, and they net them, take their necessary data, and it's a relatively low mortality rate. I would say the DNR would say that it's probably pretty good, but there is some mortality there. So it's important to note here that the graph is showing percentages, not numbers. So I wanted to note that the lower sample size, because it's a lower sample size, doesn't necessarily have as much statistical significance as the higher sample size. As sample size increases, so does the representation of the population. So that's statistical significance increases as sample size does. So important there. So age to growth, this is really the meat and potatoes of what I wanted to get into. You hear all sorts of things like recently I heard that smallmouth bass in a certain body of water in the state of Minnesota grow 13 years. It takes them 13 years to grow 13 inches, which may be true, but 4-year average growth for 4 years in the state of Minnesota was 14.6 inches. So Minnesota DNR reports growth over 4 years. This average that I derived was derived from lakes that had this 4-year average growth listed on. So I used DNR Lake Finder. I found every smallmouth lake that I knew that had a decent population of smallmouth and was relatively applicable to Mille. And I took their 4-year growth, divided it by how many entries I had, and got 14.6. Mille is pretty close to this average with 14.7 in this data set. And this general average growth of 14.5-ish inches applies to most smallmouth lakes in the state of Minnesota. So let's dive into this graph here a little bit. So 200 millimeters at age 1 is right around 7.5 inches. That's the most growth, obviously. And then 500 millimeters, so it's kind of the top end of this graph here, over at 13 years, is 19.6 inches. So the y-axis here is representing length in millimeters, and the x-axis is representing years, age 0 to 1, or 0 to 13. So it's important to note that the slope of the curve really flattens out, meaning that as those fish get older, they are growing a lot less, meaning that it takes a lot longer to go from, say, that 16-inch mark to that 20-inch mark. So it takes about 5 years to reach 16 inches, and then another 6 to 7 years on top of that to reach right around 20 inches. So like I said, there are lakes and bodies of water that are on both ends of the spectrum on this average. I'm sure there are smallmouth lakes that grow much faster, and I'm sure there are some that grow much slower. So moving forward here, we have a very, very valuable resource. Resorts and guide services rely on this abundance. Much of the area's economy hinges on the tourism that the lake brings. And the fishery has transitioned into a destination smallmouth lake. We were ranked as the number one bass lake in the world. And my happy clients here can attest to the fact that there's a lot of joy to be had from the tourism and from the fishery. Two great smallmouth there. Move forward here. So protecting our resource. What can we do to protect our resource? We have this very valuable fishery that I think many of us take for granted in the area, but I try not to. First of all, practice safe catch and release. This includes having the proper release tools. I like regular size pliers and then a long nose pliers. So if they're hooked deeply, you can get that out. Also hook cutters. Don't be afraid to cut hooks. Jigs are cheap. Treble hooks are cheap. Fish aren't. Replacing that resource is not cheap. So play them quickly. Don't troll with them behind the boat. Don't mess around. Get them in the boat and back in the water as soon as possible. And as a general rule of thumb, I heard this the other day. As a general rule of thumb, do not keep fish out of the water longer than you can hold your breath. Those fish derive oxygen from the water, and they can't do that from the air. So you're suffocating them by having them out of the water. Now, a little bit of that's fine. Leave them in the net, get your hook out, leave them in the net, get ready for the picture, snap a couple of pictures, back in the water as soon as you can. Try and minimize that time that those fish are deprived of oxygen. And I'm really going to advocate for catch and release. I don't want to advocate for keeping smallmouth at all. But for those who need to harvest smallmouth bass, please practice selective harvest. So I'm allergic to fish. I've never eaten a fish in my life. Terrible anaphylaxis ensues. So it's very hypocritical of me to say, oh, don't keep fish, because it's really easy for me to not keep fish. Please practice selective harvest. That's what I'm asking of those who do decide to keep smallmouth bass. None of our guide services, whether it's Matt's Fishing, Laguna Guide Service, Windy Fishing, none of us allow keeping smallmouth in the boat whatsoever. You can do that on your own time, but for those who need to, please practice selective harvest. This selective harvest is tough to define beyond just the name, right? It's selectively harvesting your take. What this means as far as protecting the fishery, if you keep the smaller fish, the larger ones can spawn, right? If we if we take those large fish out of there, they can't spawn. And the larger fish have a higher spawn efficacy than the smaller ones. So when we get up to that top end of whatever our regulation is, we're nearing some really great spawning fish. So keep them on the lower end of that, whatever that regulation is as far as smallmouth, I don't even know. And it takes a lesser amount of time to reproduce and grow those small ones. Now, I'm not saying that if we keep all the small ones, we won't see a greater effect on the top end of things, but those larger, the key point here is those larger fish spawn more effectively with a higher efficacy. So we have better hatches of smallmouth yearly. So like I said, I'm always going to advocate for strictly catch and release. That is everything that we do. However, for those who do need to keep smallmouth, please practice selective harvest. Sources, my graphs were received from Tom Heinrich, the Mille Lacs area's fisheries supervisor. Huge thanks to Tom for giving me this data, as well as talking to me about all this. Then any data that I derived was just from Minnesota DNR Lake Finder, just searching lakes and looking at the fisheries lake surveys that they have available. Lastly, thank you guys for watching. I hope that this helped understand the fishery a little bit and the population of smallmouth bass, as well as the age to grow. That was really the part that I was most excited about. You hear all these things, 20 years for 20 inches, and that may be the case, but at least the data derived from this study showed that it takes about 13 years for those fish to grow to 20 inches, and even longer to grow beyond that. I mean, you can see the way that the curve flattened out. So those fish are taking a really long time to grow to trophy size. Feel free to contact me with any questions you have. I'm always available, and feel free to contact me to book a trip. We will be booking I'm booking guide trips right now. I've got a couple days here after finals where I'm kind of taking it easy. And then as soon as the guide season starts, I'll be on the water every day. So email and Facebook and Instagram are there for you guys. Thanks for watching, guys. If I don't see you in the boat this summer, tight lines.